Shit. Okay. Welcome to Best Practice, a show where we interview leaders in the building industry to unpack the tools, strategies, and tactics they use to run great organizations. Today, I'm very excited to be joined by Matthew Keeshin. Matthew is a digital strategist with a background in architecture and writing. He currently serves as digital media manager at ZGF, and he works with teams across the firm's 6 offices to tell stories about design and reveal the people behind the buildings. Thank you so much, Matthew, for joining me.
Thanks for having me, George.
Yeah, to start, it would be great to just have a little bit of an overview about, your career to date, how you got started in the more the communications and marketing side. Would love to share that.
Yeah, so I come from a long line of sensitive creative types. Mom's an artist. Dad went to architecture school for a year, but wound up as a computer programmer. So there was a lot of characters across the childhood who are artists and architects, and then landed at Syracuse University in their architecture program. Wasn't at the time, I was like 18 and wasn't really quite sure what I wanted to do, but I thought, I can do everything. So transferred to art school and literally tried to do is pretty much everything that I possibly could, as far as trying to fashion myself as like a Buckminster Fuller type. But of course I kind of lacked the math component there. But in any case, after kind of bouncing around, I had a number of professors who were like, you really should be a writer. And on the 5th time that happened, I was on a program in Prague in a drag bar. And finally someone took me and said, like, no, you really, the writing thing's probably better for you. So I was like, all right, well, take me off the dance floor for this, so it must be important.
Amazing.
And I returned for my senior year and developed a writing portfolio. I knew I wanted to cover developments and news for art and design. And as soon as I had my thesis published, which essentially was like a critique of design school, I sent out the interviews that I had conducted. As part of that thesis, I had interviewed people I had interned for. So gallery dealer, design gallerists, independent designers. So I used all those interviews to get published in print pretty fast. And then once I kind of had a few clippings, was able to build on that, where I landed at Architizer in New York, followed by Dwell as a digital editor there. And then finally really wanted to get into and be at a firm, as much as I loved kind of the constant pulse pounding chaos that a publication brings, and wound up at Gensler running their social media at a firm-wide level, and now at ZGF, working, as you mentioned, with the 6 offices, focused on essentially content marketing, telling stories about the firm, bringing that to the forefront, and managing our suite of tools with our team, of course, from the website to social media, and really putting more of a journalistic twist on how we position and message ourselves. So as of in just a month or two will be my two-year anniversary. So that's how I've landed at ZGF.
So you're going from a place like Architizer, Dwell, and then going to firms. What were the biggest contrasts? I mean, you mentioned a little bit about the kind of daily pulse, or maybe the hectic scramble of journalism. But other than that, was there anything culturally or anything that you felt you had to get adjusted to? Or it'd be interesting to speak about that.
I think the speed was certainly one of them. Going through like a fact-checking process can definitely be time-consuming and stressful. I think I probably jumped through a lot more hoops to get things signed off at firms rather than, hey, I'm going to publish you. So that's kind of not the most exciting answer. I think what's been very similar in general has been just really a passion for what people do. I think working with colleagues who were writers and editors, everybody had a shared passion for design. And I think that ran a wide range. It's certainly similar at firms, but I think there's a little bit more like rah, 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 where this firm or that firm kind of attitude, which is, it's one firm. I'm not writing about, 12 on a given basis. So, overall, not really too much of a difference other than I think just different decision-making processes.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, to unpack that a little bit, where do you sit within, let's say, you can use Gensler or ZGF as an example, but just very curious, like where does a role like, let's say Gensler specifically, like social media rest within the team, the broader marketing team? And I'm curious about the same with your current role at ZGF.
Yeah, so with Gensler, there was a firm-wide marketing team, and then there were the local and regional teams. So we provided support there. I reported to the firm-wide director of marketing in that team, and we were kind of dispensed accordingly. There was a handful of in-house publications that we were in charge of that then the local and regional teams would use. And then we oversaw the website, social, and formed essentially like the go-to resources if people were going after a pursuit or trying to get press. It's, now going from like 6,000 people to about 700, or I can't remember how many people Gensler had. It was at some point it was 2,000, it was 4,000.
Yeah, it's just
2,000 people to
a couple zeros.
Yeah, a couple hundred now. Kind of a similar setup. I report to our director of communications and work with the 6 offices to, form stories, connect with press, and create those resources. I think, I'd say right off the cuff, just our main blog. And then those are used by the marketing teams or the PR teams to share with stakeholders. So I'd say it's been that case for the last 4 years. So it's kind of fluid. It's kind of a horizontal position in some ways because architecture is a team sport. So if we're doing something in Portland, we have to understand what that market is, and that PR manager and PR coordinator are going to be the expert on that. So how can we position something on the website or in a story or position a story to press or to a client that's going to have the most impact.
So as a firm-wide resource, what are the kind of protocols in place for you to be effective, right? With considering the fact that, let's say, across 6 offices at any given moment, there's a lot of projects that are happening right at the same time. How do you triage that kind of demand on your time potentially, right? Or like people, is your week well structured, or would you say that actually like you have to be in your role very nimble in this and react to local needs as necessary?
I'd say, the ZGF team that I work with now has been very good about being nimble for firm-wide initiatives and campaigns. So it makes everything actually really smooth. So I would say, having been based in New York, but have colleagues across the country, at Gensler across the world, we usually, it hasn't really been too much of an issue. I think everyone's been very good about when we have a campaign that we're releasing, how we want to release that firm-wide, coming up with the assets together that we can share with people who hold relationships or looking to develop new ones with clients or partners. So I think it's always been like if we're doing a campaign, usually in the form of a campaign is how we've been really able to connect everybody, but also listening and hearing what everyone's working on so we can determine what's going to be the most, bang for our buck.
And when it's, you mentioned a little bit before about how, and I'll just use Portland as a market example, but let's say you have a PR point person in Portland. That person surfaces back information to you in a way that's helpful to structure a campaign. What does that information typically look like, at least at the market level? Is it as an example, like at WeWork, you would see a lot of data being surfaced, like actual information as to like where businesses were located, demographics at a pretty high resolution level. Obviously, it's a very different sort of the end customer for WeWork is very different from like what you're trying to go after. But I'm just very curious about what that resolution looks like, and is it?
Yeah, so I'd say it tends to hinder more on qualitative data. If we're going after, and that might just be interactions with partners and principals, or feedback from marketing directors and marketing teams. We didn't get a pursuit because XYZ. So can we put content on the website that's going to have that? So that's one way I think we've worked together. I mean, we've been the PR managers and I have been pretty good at staying in touch as far as when we connect on these firm-wide initiatives, whether it's landing press or someone has a pursuit and they want to just switch out a homepage image. So I think as far as analytics go, that's been something we've been honing for a while. In general, we're going through a website refresh right now. So we're doing things from scratch that are just going to help inform everybody a lot better than our current suite of products. So I think we'll eventually have better quantitative analytics, but we do a mix of, I'll share this performed well on the website or this performed well on social. And then we combine that with what kind of the whispers and murmurs happening on the ground at any given office.
Yeah. Do you feel that having worked at Gensler, one of the largest firms in the world when it comes to that, and especially in the social media side, I'm sure I'm personally just super curious about what does a social media look like at an architecture firm at that scale, in a way that can be either attributable back to clients that have been won, or maybe the KPIs for that are just very different. Maybe it's about just building general audiences without necessarily attributing directly. But I'm very curious to how did social media play out at a company like Gensler?
So I would say for the work I've done at firms, social media has always been to me like a point of entry. It's like soft sales. It's a point of discovery. It's a place to, promote and publish and engage with followers who share the same interests, have a passion for design, and position yourself to be a resource for design. I think that was something that has always been kind of a frequent request. In some ways it's competitive. We want to make sure that we're putting our best work out there. So when people are just browsing along, which has happened before, someone sees Instagram, calls up. The frequency of that, I think has been hard to measure. I have friends at various firms who've occasionally shared like, oh, we got someone from Instagram or this and that. I think at the end of the day, architecture has always been kind of industry based on handshakes. So it's really important, I think, just to position yourself where you're gonna, it's like blackjack, right? You want to beat the house, but you don't know what they're gonna deal. So you're always just anticipating to try and have the better deck. So I think that's very similar to just social media in general. You want to put yourself out there in a way that's just going to differentiate you from your competitors, and hopefully tell a story that's authentic to your firm and shows how well, shows that you're different, that you have a point of view, you have a great body of work and a great culture.
And you mentioned storytelling, which is another aspect of what you do on a day-to-day basis, craft stories around buildings and stuff like that. I'm curious for where does the strategy for storytelling begin on any given project? Um, you know, basically, is there a playbook in place that helps you understand, okay, for like certain types of projects, this is the type of story that we're telling? Or are you much more nuanced and trying to figure out like what is special to that? I'm just very curious, like how do you structure that process in general across, whether it was at Gensler or ZGF?
Yeah, I think, determining what's going to resonate the most with an audience is going to be, it kind of starts from the beginning as soon as you know that the project has been accepted. At the same time, once a project is completed, that may be the first time people are willing to share about it. So I think what's important is really just to think where the story is. Sometimes a design sells itself. So you can really you don't have to embellish that much. Other times a project may not be, a project may have other facets or ideas attached to it. It could be more of an interior design story, if you're doing a historic renovation, or it's not always, you kind of have to dig. You can't just say, well, we broke ground or we acquired the project, therefore that's the story. What about the practitioners? Like, is there something in their wheelhouse, thought leadership, that we can connect to that, show the breadth and depth of our expertise? So I think when we try and determine what makes a good story, we're always trying to think like, is there more than just the building? Like a lot of times I've thought, how can you tell the stories of the people behind the building?
And with that in telling those stories, I imagine that part of the outcome is ultimately that this story, whether it comes out as a blog post or as a series of other collateral or assets, that's also used to arm I'm assuming, was it studio heads, or like how does that help then basically prepare your whether it's the BD team or studio directors, like to go out and proselytize that story, or just like go out and speak the gospel in a way?
Well, I think it's pretty common for people to rely on their architects as advisors. And I think that's, it's a great way for people to hold relationships with clients or gain new ones. If, you met somebody at something and you follow up with them and say like, hey, I wrote this, or hey, my firm put this out. It's kind of like little gestures like that ultimately can have a big impact. When I was at Gensler and the umpteenth article about how the open office is dead. Obviously, offices are having a whole other issue now.
Yeah.
But at the time when that occurred, clients came to us and were like, well, we just designed all these open offices and now the New Yorker's saying it's bad. What do we do? And ultimately we put out a statement and we created content that could back those questions up and support people that held relationships. And ultimately we got work from that. We got some consulting jobs and we were able to, I think make everybody feel comfortable that they made the right choices, which ultimately, all firms are different. They have different relationships. But, ultimately I think when it's not, it's hard to say what's common, but ultimately if something goes wrong or you have a question or design is the solution, an architect should be the first person that you call up.
Are there teams around and when you say architects, do you mean specifically like the studio directors, or how?
Yeah, I would say people that, studio, at ZGF, we have, we don't have like designated studios, but the partners and principals who own the relationships, really anybody who's a relationship owner, that's what we try and support.
And because I'm sort of mapping this out in my head. I'm like seeing like there's a principal, let's say Portland. There's a principal in Portland. Then there's around that principal, there's support from marketing, PR, that then helps to coordinate, right, the strategies that are being developed on a local level. So that basically the assumption here that I'm making is ultimately that the principal, while maybe 50% of their time is going out to get work, or to making an assumption here, but some part of their time is relegated to getting work. They still have to have this other support vehicle behind them to be able to give them that material, and there has to be some visibility between the relationships that principal has and the marketing team and the PR team, right? And I'm just very curious about what that organization looks like in some way, like because there's the part where it's like, okay, we got this project, let's take the story of this project and let's find other people that have these needs. What I'm trying to sort of understand is like, how active of a process is this? Is it somewhat passive, where it's more like, hey, here's an update, go send it out to your contacts? Or is it, hey, we know that after this project, there's probably some new bill being passed or something else that's going to open up some sort of funding that's going to then lead to these other organizations having the same need as the project that we just
yeah, so it's kind of symbiotic. Like, so we try and stay in contact with everybody as frequently as possible. I think as far as what my team initiates is when we have a campaign or compile our resources in conversations that have been occurring in each office. That's usually been the case for, we need X, Y, we need to send an e-blast off. We need to, get this story out the door. We know what, this is coverage in this publication is going to help, support this cause or show or get this work out there. So I mean, all to say, we have some teams in offices who do, both PR and marketing. Sometimes people are exclusively marketing, sometimes they're exclusively PR. And I think it's pretty common, I think, no matter what scale the architecture firm, that sometimes those departments kind of are a bit of a catch-all. So I think everyone's been pretty communicative and supportive when, something's down the pipeline. I think, it's something that's always kind of changing depending what market we're going after. But, ultimately the process is what's the communication strategy? How does it support how we're getting RFPs, how we're going after them, or how they're coming to us? And the short answer after all that would be what content, what marketing collateral do we have in the hopper that we can share out or pitch to people so that we can either secure stories or keep a relationship going.
Where do you think the biggest areas of potential evolution are? Or like, I'm curious about where do you also anyways like get your inspiration from on like on a day-to-day basis? What are you reading right now, or what are you to be able to help you either become a better storyteller or?
Yeah, I think I always try and follow, what I found to be helpful is just following like specific design writers, or really any writer or journalist whose work I like. I kind of I make sure to subscribe to all the newsletters, Dezeen, Art Daily, Sight Unseen. And also I've cultivated a network of friends who are all pretty similar fields. So I think we're pretty good at inspiring each other. I try and, when I can, to look outside of architecture and design, just because, can't look at that all the time.
Yeah. The echo chamber, as they call it.
Yeah, I mean, I love movies. So I feel like, I can tell you I've watched like the most movies I've ever watched over the last 8 months. But um, yeah, I think I try and just see what other, I also try and see like what other industries are doing. When I guess it was like 5 years ago, people pivoted to video.
Mm,
Say the architecture and design industry did that immediately. I think it took some time. I remember there actually was a really great series that Hugo Boss did,
mm,
GQ, where I can't remember the actor, but I think it was Edgar Ramirez, who had, and he was just going to like Crown Hall and IIT by Mies van der Rohe and doing, he did a bunch, there's like this whole Mies van der Rohe series. And I was like, oh, this is like what I've always wanted to see.
awesome.
So
Yeah.
I try and think about, what's the end to a story. Like you can't always go like, this gigantic building is so square and so much glass. It's not always the first thing that's going to attract somebody. So, if you care about how a building looks, you'll certainly care how a building feels. And it's really, I think, trying to connect with writing a story that's the second best thing to actually being in it.
Mm. Do you have on either at ZGF or Gensler, were there any videographers on the team or anybody that was like solely dedicated to making video?
Yeah, so we had we have a few we have a few people here who I would say like uh, when we need to hustle something together, we can. At Gensler, we had there was a position essentially that was a photography department. So whether it was like a firm-wide photographer or photo editor or literally a handful of photographers that were on staff, that was the case. I think, when you talk about branding, if, and I think like there was a really good article in the zine about the director of visual branding at Foster and Partners. And,
Mm,
really what that position shows is they have a very specific look from everything from built work to renders to their website to all of that.
mm,
So I think, when for people who are on who've registered for this and are listening, like I think it's just determining who and how you want to work.
yeah.
I've worked with a handful of other freelance photographers, and I'd say that's probably more common, is that people have their go-to photographers. So I think it's also that too, finding the right partners that can help articulate that, because it just depends how much video production you're doing. If I was still in magazines, I imagine there'd be more video.
Yeah, yeah. Because I'm like, I haven't read that interview, but I would definitely want to look at it after. It seems like that person is like the creative director essentially of Foster and Partners, curating everything that comes out,
Yeah.
right? From both. What's interesting is like both from not just that the brand is extended itself to also the buildings in some way and how they're represented. Like the idea that there's actually creative direction around the rendering is fascinating. There was a little bit of this at WeWork when we had the chief creative officer, where almost every single rendering was approved by this person, um, where it was like this kind of like every design element was just like redlined by this individual across hundreds of buildings, which is insane. But yeah, that level of intention to be like, everything has to come out a certain way because the entire atmosphere of the company has to be represented in a very cohesive way is pretty fascinating. I'm curious with these two instances, right? Of Gensler and ZGF, they're both large, more corporate firms. The people that they're trying to attract, in some cases, with ZGF is very, I guess in both cases, they both have very distinct practice areas. Like Gensler is very well known in commercial office space design, ZGF being more in the healthcare arena. Um, is there any shifting attitude towards how people want to consume information? In sort of the world that I navigate in, it's like constantly trying to think about like what is that other form of content that could be very compelling, that could tell the story a little bit more effectively. is something that we're constantly struggling with or thinking about. I'm very curious about where the potential opportunities within these industries to kind of break out and do something different.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, a lot, it's not just architecture, the transition from people reading to people seeing images and getting all their information from that, or reading much more significantly less words is super common. And, I think from people getting all their news from social media as well was something that occurred, and changed the game in that people just kind of want bite-sized information. Sometimes they want longer form stuff, but I think overall, at least for architecture and design, and this is why a lot of firms have done very well on like image-based platforms like Instagram, or Pinterest, where it is so visually driven. And again, the design will tell its own story in that regard. So I think it's really just pushing that, like doing more original illustrations, more, if a firm has a really strong research division, doing more speculative work. I mean, I think, you look at, more, younger firms and what Big has done, from, a thought leader perspective, as well as a content perspective, even OMA, like predating, like when people weren't, when building was slow, he wrote all the books.
Right.
So I think that approach is still pretty relevant, no matter no matter how old the firm is, or if you're starting or mid-career. I think what's important is really just to, sometimes we're all kind of just like reading a crystal ball. We don't know how something's going to be interpreted, but I think really pushing the visual language is going to continue to be something that architects will always want to do. It's some of the more fun work to do.
Yeah. No, I think
to have that imagination. I think really keeping imagination alive is going to be is something I always encourage.
Yeah, and bringing up like Big and OMA is also fascinating in the sense that like what they both did early on was really gravitate towards content as like the in different innovative ways. They focused on content, like Big focusing on video, like using tools that were off the shelf at that time. Like I'm thinking specifically about the early work with Plot, where they were doing like green screen montages right on top of like animated models, that they were leveraging the tools that were now very easily, cheaply accessible to them, and innovating on a brand new emerging platform like YouTube. And I wonder how small firms can embrace that approach of taking chances, not just in their design work, but in the way that it's communicated in a very human level too, right? Intuitive, not heady, not just like, sort of too conceptually in the clouds, but like trying to connect with people through the mediums that they're like now people are using. Like I'm very curious to see like what brand will come out to like really take ownership of TikTok or Snapchat, right? And like come up with new ways of engaging and creating audiences using their work, right? Like love to see a building as a Snapchat filter put out by a firm, and just in a way to create a different dialogue and bring bring some more awareness to culturally, right, to these firms, which I think would be really compelling and generate new audiences that might not have ever thought about. I mean, I'm always continuously fascinated about this. The fact that like Architectural Digest has like 3.4 million views touring someone's house, right? And I just think about like what's the firm that's going to be savvy about that and kind of like figure out a way to implant their project in there, right? It's like after a project is done, let's say College Travel doesn't do this, but I'm just thinking about his projects and how sometimes they're used as backdrops for sci-fi movies. It's like the intention of taking the project and like figuring out that maybe that project story can also be shared with other people in other industries that would use it as like a backdrop for a movie or something, right? Like figuring out ways to bring awareness at that level. That circles back to just like, how do you get your output out there into the world in more interesting ways? I don't know. That's a little bit of a rant for me.
Well, I think, it definitely, I've definitely tried to pitch, like, let's create a Snapchat filter before.
Let's do it. Let's go.
So, I think, what that would actually look like, I have no idea. You're not just going to turn somebody into a building.
I don't know. I mean, but there are those famous. There's that famous governor. What is it? New York, the ball picture of like all the architects wearing their buildings.
Oh yeah. The Beaux-Arts
The
ball.
Beaux-Arts Spa. So I think
Yeah.
the Halloween one. It could be for Halloween.
It could be. Yeah. It could. Tis the season. Yeah. I think I think it'll be really, it's going to take one person to do something like that, and everybody's going to follow, which is usually, I think, what's happened with, I think as soon as like architects were featured on TED Talks, and I don't know if you remember the series that Vice did a while ago. I think their partnership was with Intel. They talked to all these like people across music, design, theater, film, and it was a really great series, which I don't know if you can find. It was the Creative Project.
Yes, I remember that. Yeah.
And that was like an early kind of foreshadowing, I think, of architects being called on that. So I think like when you're figuring out what your like PR or marketing strategy is, how you're going to position yourself as a leader, as an expert, looking at, staying with the times and seeing where the best fit is for you, and in some degrees too, like you don't need to be on every single social media platform in order to get, and that was not common for a long time. Everybody still felt they had to like keep up with everything, but ultimately it's what your strategy is and what you're saying and who you're engaging with. I can confidently say I've been at 2 firms where a lot of the time we were just getting solicited for, where's my application? So ultimately, like, it's not like, you want to make sure that, if you're responding to somebody, that you're having a more meaningful conversation, and how are you developing a relationship? And because I think it's the conversion all the time is, you could have 1 million followers, but you might really only get 2 or 3, lifetime clients. So I think understanding that too, like, what's the purpose? If this is just something to have fun, show the culture of your firm, then that is a great marketing tool. It will be an introduction. It will be a point of entry for someone to discover your work, whether they accept a job and, are just kind of doing some background info, or if a client is like, well, who are these guys? Like, let's see, let me go on their accounts or whatever, and or see what they're posting, how frequently they're updating their website. So yeah, I think it all, I don't think it's the right answer, but ultimately you want to put out, I think, the firm you want to be. Honestly, sometimes you get work that's, it may not be the most innovative work, but it's keeping the lights on. And if you get like one of those real like show-stopping projects, then you put that on blast, or use that to attract a client. So because ultimately it comes down to budget, like but
I mean, with
relationships and having a good flow of content is ultimately, I think, where you want to be.
And the thing is, like, for smaller firms that might be sort of curious about, well, how do I even, don't have enough hours in the day, don't have the budget necessarily to do this. There are avenues. I mean, first of all, most small firms or all architecture firms are constantly generating content. They are content machines. Every opportunity to like zoom into a detail in their Revit model or AutoCAD file is like a potential screenshot that could easily be posted right on Instagram or Pinterest. Obviously, I think you would agree too, is that a lot of this has to really match up with who your target client is. So like when you say like projecting the firm out into the world, right? Or what the firm you want to be, it's also the firm you want to be with the right client, right? Like to attract the right clients, that it sort of creates a sort of a flywheel, right? The more you invest in that, the more people come to you because it's less effort over time.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a good segue just to talk about analytics and how that can play into your strategy, which is, you want to be monitoring what's working, what's not. I think it's a little harder to monitor press, like, unless someone calls you up and say, I saw this and that, it's tricky to really kind of have a concrete answer. But I think using analytics is a way to inform your process, like what got the most views, what had the most reach, what got the most engagement. Is that something that, was that as intentional as we thought it was? How do we how do we send this message out or get this client? I think it's a mix of what, establishing your business goals, when you launch a campaign, figuring out which writers and editors you want to connect with so that you can really get the most reach out of that. It's not just posting something, it's really maintaining relationships for a launch. Like if your whole campaign goal is to be featured in the New York Times, how is that going to be accomplished? So I think it really comes down to, if you're featured in the New York Times, no one's going to go, well, how many like website impressions do you have monthly? It's not really the case. So I think it's really just determining what your goals are and figuring out the best metrics that are going to support it. A metric could be, okay, well, we have a sales funnel and we got X amount of business this year, or it could be we did a campaign, or we a big goal of ours was to get into this publication because we know it will help us.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I think we have a couple questions which I think we'll kind of close off with a bit. So Dennis says, as you mentioned, I've also noticed that getting clients in architecture is very much done in person. How have you noticed things change over the last few months now that things can't be done in person?
Zoom. From what I hear from project teams, it's been people were worried, obviously, in the first, 3 days of everything changing. But as long as you remain adaptive, I think, it also puts everybody on the same playing field to some degree, that in a way it has not before. So I think people are, from what I can gather, architects, designers, firms are really kind of, making the best of a tough situation. I think they're navigating when a client asks, okay, you need to be in person. Ultimately, safety first. So I think through Zoom, through emails, through phone calls, I think we used to rely a lot on text messaging and emails, and now people are getting back on the phone.
Wow.
So I think, it's not as a horrific response as I think it's been, but ultimately, I think people are making the most of this situation.
Do you think this is going to, I mean, you work remote, right? You're working remote. Yeah. So the whole Monograph team works remote. And I'm curious, for your firm, do you see it as the new normal, basically? Like, has this period of time now made it apparent that actually things don't just like stop, right? Like in the sense of, I mean, work might slow down a bit, but actually the internal processes of the company can still operate in a more hybrid model or in a fully remote model in this case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think I think everyone will adapt accordingly. Architecture, from what I can understand, was never the first industry to say, yeah, work from home, you'll get your work done. What about those billable hours? But now I think that people can see they can do it. There will be some flexibility going forward. It seems, it's like if you give somebody something, you can't just take it away.
Yeah.
Particularly if productivity is still good, and it's, I think the way that we've adapted through all of this, where everybody's like, don't come into the office, then it's very easy. But I think as far as how companies are navigating right now, it's still uncertain territory. You have some companies who are like, don't come back to the office until summer 2021, where you have other offices being, I'm just saying companies in general,
Yeah.
trying to really figure out the safest return to office plan.
Yeah. So by your measure, it hasn't really impacted the nature of which how you communicate with your teams. Like have you seen any positive change? Like, has it been a plus or negative, or is it just case by case?
I would say overall, well, for me, it actually hasn't changed too much actually, because I work a lot with people on the West Coast.
Mm,
So working from home has not been that much of a radical change for the work that I do. I think for some, other colleagues, when you can't just like schedule a conference room and a client can come in, I think, if anything, everybody just misses the ability to be together.
yeah.
So, but I think overall there's been, nobody's fighting over conference rooms that are overbooked, but I think ultimately everyone stayed connected and went in productive and positive ways.
Cool. So I typically like to end with a couple. Are there any more? If there are some more questions, we can answer them. Otherwise, I typically like to end with a couple of questions. One is, what are your favorite tools to use right now in your work?
We've done a similar interview questionnaire with people, and I'm used to asking the question, not answering it. At the end of the day, like I'm a compulsive drawer and sketcher, so a pen and pencil and paper, or any combination of that, always is the most. If I'm having trouble communicating something to a designer or a colleague, I'll just draw it out and it resolves itself.
Oh, very cool. And the last question is typically sort of left field, but what is the nicest thing anyone's ever done for you?
Nicest thing anyone's ever done for me.
Yeah. Yeah, we get a lot of different answers to that one. It can go pretty deep. It can go not so deep, but yeah.
I'm trying to think of a really good compliment someone gave me once, but I'm trying to. Well, we can go back to that. A friend of mine, I just watched Russian Doll, and I was catching up with this friend, and I was like, oh, I just like want to be like Natasha Lyonne. Like I was just like completely captivated by the originality of the series and all this. And she goes, I was like, yeah, I loved her voice. Like, it's such a cool voice. And she's like, well, you're like 5 cigarettes away from Natasha Lyonne. And I was like, thank you. That was really nice. I don't think I'm nearly as cool as Natasha Lyonne. So I'll take it.
Yeah, that's such a great performance in that show. Cool. Well, I think this is a good place to stop. Thank you so much, Matthew, for kind of unpacking a little bit about what you do, what you're working on, and everything. And it'll be great to have you again, so maybe we can talk a little bit more in depth about content strategy specifically.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, thank you for having me, and it was great to hear from Chloe, former architizer, who made the recommendation. So yeah, looking forward to keep talking.
Yeah, Chloe on the Monograph team, she's a rock star. She's awesome. So yeah, so for everybody, this has been best practice. Just as a recap, we is brought to you by Monograph. I'm part of Monograph, and if you're interested in actually using productivity software that can help you see real-time visibility into your budgets, projects, and all that, and allow you to collaborate remotely with the team and be able to get real-time project information, then feel free to sign up for a free trial today. Thank you, Matthew, so much, and thanks everyone. Cheers.
All right. Thanks, George.